20 years ago, actually, probably about this time, 20 years ago, my wife and I made the decision to adopt a child. Happens to be sitting right here. Spoiler, it worked. But we made that decision that we were going to adopt. And that whole process, if you have ever gone through adoption, it's one of the most incredible things you'll ever do, and it can be also one of the most frustrating things you ever do. The incredible part is knowing that you're going to be bringing a new person into the family. And the frustrating part is all of the bureaucratic stuff that you have to go through to get to that point. Because in addition to all of the angst and the emotional roller coaster that comes with the process, you've got the paper chase. There's documents to create. There's documents to fill out. There's documents that you need to get copies of. And it seems like everything you get has to be notarized. And here's the dirty little secret about international adoptions. Just having something notarized is no good. I mean, think about it. When we get something notarized, we understand what that means. That is somebody putting a seal on the paper saying, I verify that this person here signed it, this person is who they said they were, and sometimes it even means this document is what it says it is. But then if you take that paper and you send it somewhere else, or if we here receive that paper from some other country, what do we know by looking at that stamp? I mean, to a foreign agency looking at a notary stamp from another country, how do they know if, Susie Smith is an actual bona fide, trustworthy notary public, or is this coming from Susie Smith's notary and sheep neutering service? So, about 50 years ago, they came up with the idea of the apostille. The apostille, and when I first heard about it, I thought it was some weird bureaucratic joke. But the apostille is a seal that the state puts on, a notary's seal, that verifies that, yes, that notary actually is a real notary and is in good standing. And of course, to get something apostilled, you have to go to the Secretary of State's office in the state where the notary is licensed or registered. And in our case, since we had documents notarized in 2 different states, Illinois and Wisconsin, we had to have these things apostilled in 2 different states. And that's about as much fun as it sounds. But all of that idea of doing something to prove that what you're giving somebody is legitimate, or doing something to prove that you are who you say you are, or you are doing what you say you're going to do, that's all part of today's Old Testament reading. So think back to the reading we had just before the Gospel, the reading of Abram. Let's get this out of the way up front. That has to be one of the weirdest things you have read in the Old Testament. Because, animals getting cut in half. Abram falls asleep and there's this weird parade where the smoke pot and the torch go down in between the animal parts. What's that all about? Find out, we look at the context. So we have Abram. Abram, remember, soon to be Abraham. Abram picked up and he left Ur because God tapped him on the shoulder and said, hey, Abram, I want you to go. I want you to pick up your family. I want you to pick up everything you've got and go to this new place that I'm going to show you. And Abram did. And along the way, God promised Abram that he would have a son, because Abram has not had a son yet. But he would have a son who would be his heir. And now here, at this point in the story, Abram is in this new land, and he's old, and he's still childless. And yet God keeps telling him great things are going to happen. Great things are coming. Trust me, Abram. So in the discussion in today's scripture, Abram is questioning God. And God repeats the promise. And then God takes Abram outside and he points up to the sky and he says, trust me, your descendants will outnumber the stars you see in the sky. Pretty big promise to make to somebody who is at this point about 100 years old. And if you're wondering, I was, because I looked it up. Without light pollution, which is a problem almost everywhere today, when you look up at the sky in that region of the world, you see about 8,000 stars. So God is promising Abram this multitude that is going to descend from him, greater than 8,000. And not only that, God promises Abram that his descendants are actually going to own the land where Abram is staying right now. Right now, Abram is there as a visitor. God tells him, your descendants are going to own this land. This is going to be their kingdom. This is going to be their permanent home. And Abram says, okay, I mean, you're telling me that, but how do I know it's true? And that sets the stage for this weird thing that we see. And it also sets the stage for a couple of thousand years of debate over what exactly did happen that night and what it meant. Because after Abram questioned God, God said, all right, I'm going to show you. And yet God placed what seems like possibly the world's first Grubhub order. It says, Abram, bring me a cow, a goat, a ram, and some birds. Now, if you're a student of Middle Eastern culture of that time, you probably suspect now that whatever happens next is not going to be something sanctioned by the ASPCA. And you're right. Because once Abram has the animals gathered together for God, Abram digs a trench in the dirt. We don't know how long, but he digs this trench. And then he takes the animals. And if you have a sensitive soul, I'm sorry. But he takes the animals and he cuts them in half. And he puts one half on either side of this trench for each of the animals. And now you understand what the trench is for, because that's where the blood is flowing. And then we're told, darkness comes. And this terrifying darkness descends upon Abram and he falls into a deep sleep. And it's while he's in this deep sleep that two things happen. First, and this is part of the scripture that was left out today. First, God tells Abram about what's going to happen to his descendants when they are held captive in Egypt for several centuries. And then he tells them that they are going to be delivered out of Egypt and they are going to eventually come home to this very land where Abram is right now. And then we see the finale. And the finale, we're told, is a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass through between the animal slices down this trench. as we read this, we're left with the question, what is going on here? Why is this happening? Why did they do this? And that's a question biblical scholars have been struggling with for a long time. When you look at the literature, you find that biblical scholars have killed an awful lot of trees trying to figure this out. Because this is a one-off experience. There is nothing quite like this anywhere else in the Bible. There's no other ceremony like this exactly in the Hebrew culture of the time. So then they start expanding out. They start looking at the other surrounding cultures. Because remember, Abram was not Hebrew at that point. So is this something he got from somewhere else? And they've looked at this, and the scholars can tell you what it's not. They can say it's not really a sacrifice, even though animals did end up dead. And they can tell you it's not a form of divination, which was a way of fortune-telling, and it's not a spell casting exactly, even though there's elements of all of that to it. But it's something different. And my favorite explanation, it was in the NIV Cultural Study Bible. My favorite explanation is this, and I'll read it. It says, the only example of ritual participants passing between the pieces of several cut-up animals occurs in a Hittite military ritual. In response to the army's defeat, several animals are cut in half, as well as a human being. And the army passes through the parts on their way to sprinkling themselves with water from the river to purify themselves, in the idea that this will ensure a better outcome next time. And then, almost as though they have a sense of humor, the writer concludes, the obvious problem with this is that there was no battle and there was no army, and he was not Hittite. Okay, then why bring it up? I mean, when you're saying, yeah, it's kind of like this, except it's really nothing like this, you have to make me wonder. You wade through all of this stuff. And there's some explanations that sort of make sense, and there's some that are sort of reasonable as they could be anyway. And then, in my case, I turn back to one of the texts that I had from a class years ago. And I found that, excuse me, in that culture, in that time and place, first thing we want to know is the type of arrangement that God was talking about is called a charter covenant. That's what you have when you are granting land to somebody. And sometimes there were these very elaborate ceremonies that went along with a charter covenant. And the purpose of the ceremony was to kind of solidify and seal the deal. It was like God putting his notary stamp on it and saying, yep, this is it. And Barry Banster, who's a professor of religion and the director of academic computing at Hope College, believes that's exactly what this was, that this was a charter covenant, but just kind of expanded. And he goes on to explain that the idea of having the animals here was what he called self-condemnation. So that whoever walked this trench between the animals was saying, I promise that if I go back on my word, this is what's going to happen to me. Sort of guarantee. You know, you ever as a kid say, poke a needle in my eye, cross my heart, hope to die, poke a needle in my eye? That's sort of what God was saying. Cross my heart, hope to die, hope to get cut in half. Except it doesn't rhyme. that, as much as anything, sort of makes sense. It kind of hangs together. Now, as theories go, it has not been unchallenged. Because you can find other scholars who will say, well, it's obviously not a covenant charter covenant. Their explanations, I don't think, stand up as well as his does. So we'll go with that. The whole purpose of this thing was God to impress upon Abram that what he said was true. And then one of the obvious things that happens during the ceremony is it foreshadows the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. Because we have smoke and flame going through the trench. And if you think back to Exodus, what went before the people of Israel as they left Egypt? What led them through the darkness, through the wilderness, rather? It was a pillar of smoke and a pillar of flame. When God manifested to the Hebrew people on Mount Sinai, what did they see? They saw smoke and they saw flame. So this was a flash forward to what his descendants would see. And it was a manifestation of God specifically for the purpose of God putting his stamp on it and saying, not only do I promise, but I am showing you what it's going to look like. For Abram, remember, 100 years old, stranger in a strange land. For Abram, it was a reassurance that God keeps God's promises. And that one day his descendants really would outnumber the stars in the sky. And that's a heavy promise. And it's a heavy promise to us because we know that the creation of the nation of Israel was the cornerstone of God's plan for salvation for us. It was God's plan for our future, every bit as much as it was for Abram's. And as weird as it is, it's also a reminder that God continues to keep promises. It's a reminder as we go further into Lent that God's promises are often kept at a cost. A tremendous cost. Keep his promise that he would offer us a way of salvation, God sent his own Son to walk among us and live with us and suffer with us and die for us. God kept that promise. Left to our own devices, human beings are not always the most dependable creatures. Sometimes we make promises and then something comes along that seems more important. We let those old promises slide. Sometimes we make promises and we get distracted. Sometimes we even make promises and then find out they are just too hard to fulfill. We convince ourselves that it's okay to back up. But today's reading from Genesis reminds us that God promises never to take the easy way out. And God never has. Whether it means God patiently puts up with our own human failings, or whether it means offering up his own Son as a means of salvation, God has never taken the easy road. God's own Son never took the easy road. Instead, he followed the path that was chosen for him every step of the way from the manger to the cross. Which leaves us here. In this season of Lent, will we choose to follow God's instructions only when they are easy for us? Or will we choose to do the harder thing? Will we choose to do the right thing? Will we choose to love others truly as we love ourselves? Will we choose to serve others first and ourselves second? Will we choose always to speak with tolerance, to act with care, and to embrace without hesitation? In other words, will we choose to love others as God has loved us? In this world of brokenness and hate and fear, that's the only hope we've got. In Jesus' name.